Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm going to be discussing verses 27 and 28 of Baqarah. Alladhina yankaduna ahda Allah min ba'di misakahi wa yaqta'una ma amara Allahu bihi an yuswala wa yufsidun fi al-ard ulaika hum al-khasirun. Those who break the promise to God after its ratification and break what God commanded to be joined and spread corruption in the earth, they are the ones who lose everything. Kaifa takfaruna billahi wa kuntum amwatan fa'ayakum summa yumitukum summa yuhyikum summa ilayhi turja'un. How are you deluded about God while you were dead, so he gave you life? Then he caused you to die. Then to him you are returned. So it would seem that this passage is following up on the verse just before it, which referred to al-fasikin, the defiantly disobedient people, who, you'll remember, instead of being guided by God's examples, which is in Arabic masal, and that can mean metaphors that the Qur'an sets forth, but it can also mean features and things in nature of God's actual physical creation. So the fasikin are people who, instead of being guided by those examples, are led astray by them because of their own perversity of heart, their tendency to seek reasons to not believe in God and to be ungrateful to God and to reject the truth and to cover up the truth. So the first of the two verses that I just read seems to be continuing the description of those people, and therefore to be a further elaboration on what the Qur'an calls the kafirin, the people who cover up the truth instead of trying to learn the truth. And so when we come to the second verse that I just read, it's asking a rhetorical question. How can you not believe in God when he is the very reason that you possess life? And the implication here is that this is not any ordinary misunderstanding or difference of opinion. It's the symptom of a disease, of a very serious disease and a kind of perversity. Remember in verse 10 of the same surah, it says, in their hearts is a disease, so God increased them in disease. So it's a disease with God's stamp on it, that both a human stamp of the human begins it by refusing to look at the truth, refusing to acknowledge his or her debt to God, acknowledge the truth, look for the truth. But then it takes on these almost uncanny supernatural proportions because God himself is adding fuel to the fire, so to speak. And I say uncanny or supernatural because while it becomes familiar to us and we sort of take it for granted that so many people, and often the most intelligent people, most educated people, refuse to believe in God, refuse to look in the face the evidence of design, to use a kind of loaded word, in nature and in our own selves and our own lives. We've come to take that for granted, but there's something bizarre about that, truly bizarre, about that just constitutional inability to see the truth. And just like there's something bizarre and uncanny about religious people's inability to see the truth of God's message to us, which is don't form churches, do not form sects, do not invent things about me, right? But that's getting far afield from these verses. So the first question to address here is, if the first of those two verses is describing the kafirin, the rejectors of God and of the truth, why does it claim that these people have made a promise to God? If we think of all of the many people who have never believed in God, well, what promise could they have made to God? My belief at the moment is that this is no ordinary promise that's being referred to, but rather a promise that happened before we were born, outside of time, outside of space. And part of the reason I believe this, in addition to the fact that it answers that question I just posed, which is, well, not everybody makes a promise to God, right? It can't just be people that were Christian or were Muslim and then they lapsed, ceased to believe, whatever. But the stronger piece of evidence that I know of is the 172nd verse of Surah Araf, which is the 7th surah, and very important surah, very interesting surah, or very important verse, and it reads as follows: "And when your Lord took from the children of Adam," human beings, "from their backs," and that's my translation here. It's a hard word to translate, but backs is the literal translation. But we don't quite know what exactly is being referred to here. But in any case, when your Lord took from the children of Adam, from their backs, their descendants. In one way or another, it seems it's describing almost the unfolding or unpacking of all of Adam's descendants, meaning all of human beings, all the human beings that will eventually live, and made them testify upon themselves, "Am not I your Lord?" They said, "Yes, we have testified. Lest you say," meaning so that you will not say, "lest you say on the day of resurrection, indeed we were of this unaware." So my thinking is that this is the promise that Surah Baqarah, verse 27, is referring to. The promise that all of the descendants of Adam, all human beings, made to God when he sort of assembled us, took us from Adam, and said ahead of time, "Do you acknowledge that I am your Lord?" Meaning, I am your master. I am the one whom you must serve and obey at all times. And every single one of us said, "Yes, we promise, we acknowledge this, and we promise that you are our Lord, we will obey you." This makes the most sense out of the present verse to me, because it's a very fundamental promise, and it's made by the soul. And that explains why God is describing the breaking of that promise as, in one sense, the most grievous, the most horrible mistake and sin, crime that a human being can make. I've heard a Christian say, and I assume he was paraphrasing what someone else had said, that how can there be hell? How can there be an eternal punishment for a non-eternal or a temporal crime? And I think we have the answer here, which is that it's not a temporal or merely material crime. It is a kind of eternal crime because the promise that we've made happened in a place outside of time. And because we possess something that is eternal, which is our soul, and that soul is what made this promise. And so it's the soul that would be violating that promise and that would be committing a crime, which would then indeed deserve eternal punishment. Of course, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this. It's hard for anyone to wrap their heads around the idea of hell, of eternal pain and suffering. But that's not very surprising. Why would it be easy for us as temporal beings to understand the soul and the kinds of the promise that soul has made, and then the kind of crime that it can make by breaking that promise, and then the punishment that it would incur? That's all very weighty stuff. And while it's true that we possess that soul in a sense, that doesn't mean that we encompass the soul in knowledge, that we know much about it. And the Qur'an continually tells us we don't know, and I guess we learn by studying the Qur'an. Another reason for thinking that the promise being referred to in verse 27 is that promise that's kind of depicted in verse 172 of surah Araf is that the very next verse, verse 28, is then talking about this mysterious period of our existence in which we weren't yet alive, but rather dead, and yet we existed. So it says, "How are you deluded about God while you were dead, so he gave you life? Then he caused you to die, then to him you are returned." So it seems fairly clear that what God is describing here is our kind of pre-existence, or our existing without life when we were not yet born and not yet conceived. And then he gives us life, so we're born, and then he causes us to die. That would be our natural death, and then to him you are returned. So there's two deaths and two lives, and that is referred to some other times in the Quran as well. And so it would make sense if it's true that that promise that the previous verse describes is indeed a promise that happened in that pre-existence, that God would then refer to that pre-existence in the same passage. It's almost like saying, well, how if you are skeptical about this, if you're skeptical that you made a promise to God before you were a living, breathing human being, well, do you not know that you once were, but you were without life, and God gave you life? That's one understanding of this, of the kind of invisible connection between the two verses. There's some important keywords to discuss in the opening phrase of verse 27. The one I want to talk about especially is the word that's translated as ratification. The word promise is, the Arabic word for promise here is ahda. And then ratification is misak. So where does the word misak come from? It's a very interesting word, and that I think it's significant in this context. The root word basically means strong or firm, or kind of bonded or bound. So in the Lane's Arabic English lexicon, I'm just going to read some of these usages that I guess come from kind of classical Arabic texts. It was or became firm, stable, fast, or strong. He trusted or confided in him. He made it firm, stable, fast, or strong. He bound or tied him or it firmly, fast, or strongly in a bond. The knot became firm or fast. He secured himself against him by a bond or the like, or absolutely. He took or received a bond from him. Write ye it, namely the debt, for the creditor's self-securing, and for preventing contention. He closed the door firmly. So these are all usages of that root word. In the verse we're talking about, it's misak. So you have mim, sa, kaf. A lot of these words, it actually, instead of the mim at the beginning, it's wa. So wa, sa, kaf. But in different forms, verb, noun, adjective, it keeps on referring to something that is holding fast, that's knotted, that can't be undone, cannot be reversed. Just like a door that's been closed firmly, it's not necessarily locked, but it's closed, it's done. You could undo it by your own actions, but it's not just going to come open by the blowing of the wind, right? Or with a knot, you can untie that knot, but theoretically it's not going to come undone of its own accord. So these are all images or metaphors for the making fast, the making firm of a relationship, of a contract between two parties. So what this conveys to us, I think, is that the promise to God that the verse is referring to is obviously not a casual promise, and it's something that cannot be reversed. You can break that promise through your own actions, but it itself is never going to be erased. You can cover it up as much as you want, you can violate it, but it's legally binding. You can't get out of that contract. Just like if you have a debt, you can refuse to pay that debt, but it's not going to be forgiven just because you haven't paid it. And the other thing I want to mention here is that I think what's being conveyed is that, as I was saying earlier, that this is not an ordinary promise. And if my intuition or inference is correct, it's not even a promise that happened in time or space. It's a promise that happened in this moment outside of time and space. And it was entered into not by our physical person, but by our souls, which we don't have a whole lot of access to, right? I mean, there's a great verse in the 50th surah, Qaf, verse 16, where it says, and certainly we created man, and we know what whispers to him his soul, nafsahu, his soul. And we are nearer to him than his jugular vein. So what's interesting to me about that is it's saying that thing that's most a part of you, your own jugular vein, God is actually closer to you than your own body is close to you. And it's a strange image and metaphor, but in a kind of poetic way, without necessarily unpacking the literal meaning here, I think it just conveys and connotes that our own selves, our own souls, are kind of mysterious to us in a way that they're not mysterious to God, of course. He knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows what our own souls whisper to us when we're not even really aware our soul is whispering to us. It might influence us without us really knowing what's going on. And the significance of that in this context is that we have entered into a contract without necessarily knowing it or remembering it. And that's why, as I said earlier, you can have people that are not and never have been religious who nevertheless have made this promise. And partly because it's the nature of the human condition and the human experience and the human test that God has made, we don't have access to that promise in our memory, in our conscious selves. But it doesn't mean that we're not bound by it. But also, partly through our own fault, we have resisted and rejected every opportunity given to us to remember and learn about the promise that our souls have made. In other words, God has created opportunities where we can become in touch with our souls and learn about our souls, and we've refused that. And I'm saying we here confidently just because I think that's kind of human nature. If it weren't, we would all be much more spiritual people who actually kind of had insights and this kind of these visions of our own identity as souls rather than as merely as sort of physical and mental persons. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but probably very few. In any case, what I'm trying to get at here is that that promise that we've made happened not the way that religious sacraments happen. It's not as simple as someone now in this life saying, I promise to obey God. I promise to believe in God. We do that. People do that all the time. Christians do it. Muslims do it. That's what religious sacraments are all about, where you say, in the first communion in the Catholic Church when you're about 8, you take the host in this religious ceremony and you're basically agreeing to believe in that ceremony, that it's representing your communion with God through Jesus. And then later when you're about 16, then you have confirmation and you basically promise to be a practicing Christian. That's at least in the Catholic Church. And then in Islam, in order to become a Muslim, you have to do the Shahada, where you say there is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger. And there's various other things, actions, both verbal and physical, that have to be performed if you're going to remain within that community or ummah of Islam, such as fasting, such as giving a certain amount in charity. These are all what I'm calling religious sacraments. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that it has very little, if anything, to do with what God is talking about here, when he's talking about breaking the promise to God. You don't make the promise to God through these words and these actions, these religious sacraments, and you don't break the promise to God by failing to say those words or perform those actions. It's something much, much more mysterious and much, much deeper in the human being, as I'm saying, in the soul, that forms that promise and that breaks that promise, and also that hopefully avoids breaking that promise and works to resist the various, as that verse says, the various whispers that would lead us to break that promise. So this is a work of the soul, not of the person, not of the mind and body that we kind of think of as ourselves. And it really doesn't have much to do with what we call religion. Although I would add, as a side note, it's interesting that the word that I'm translating as ratification, most people translate as ratification, misak, we just talked about the kind of etymology of that word and how it has to do with a binding and a making fast, and a knotting, a tying of a knot. And that's very similar to the word religion, which comes from the Latin word religare, which means to bind. So it's interesting that both of those words, religion and ratification, coming from different traditions, but they both make use of that metaphor and imagery of binding. But I guess what I'm suggesting here is that to really bind yourself in a contract and in a relationship with God, who of course is outside of time, who is eternal, is going to require an action, an activity of the soul rather than of the body and of the mind, rather than, a verbal and physical action such as sacraments. And so I think that what this verse is prompting us to think about is the gravity of the task that the Qur'an is setting for us, as well as the gravity of the crime that it's warning us against. Okay. And so it's kind of daunting as well as inspiring to read these verses if we're reading them and really taking stock of what they're saying.